One winter evening in North Ridge, Montana, when the snow fell so thick the world seemed to disappear, a police officer walking alone beside a frozen lake saw something that should not exist. A small German shepherd puppy tied to a broken board drifting on the ice, barely breathing, barely alive. And in that moment, he had no idea that this tiny creature would change his life forever and remind an entire town what hope really looks like. But before we continue, tell us where you are watching from today, what city, what state, what country your story matters to, so leave it in the comments. And now come with us into the night, the snow, the rescue, and the miracle that should never have happened, but did. North Ridge, Montana, wore winter the way an old mountain wears a scar, without complaint, without apology, and with a kind of stern pride that made newcomers whisper instead of speak. On that late afternoon, snow fell in steady sheets, not dramatic like the movies, but relentless like paperwork. Line after line, form after form, covering every mistake until the world looked clean enough to fool a tired heart. Silver Pine Lake lay just beyond the last row of pines, a wide, dark mirror under a skin of ice that never fully trusted itself. The wind skimmed across the surface and made the frozen crust creak, as if the lake were clearing its throat before telling a story nobody wanted to hear. Officer Daniel Crow moved along the shoreline with the disciplined pace of a man who had learned to walk through trouble without inviting it to dance. He was 41, white, tall, built broad through the shoulders, the way working men often are in towns where winter forces everyone to carry more than they planned. A faint scar cut a pale comma through his right eyebrow, an old punctuation mark from a bar fight years ago when he was younger and believed pride was a kind of armor. His hair was dark and kept short, practical under a wool cap, and his eyes were the muted gray-blue of steel left out in snow. People in North Ridge said Daniel wasn't unfriendly. He simply rationed warmth the way the town rationed road, salt carefully, and only where it mattered. There had been a time, long ago, when he laughed easily. Then a roadside call came in during a blizzard, and a family didn't make it out in time. Daniel arrived too late, and the image of a car half buried in drifts became an altar he visited in silence every winter. Since then, he worked like someone trying to repay a debt the universe never itemized. His uniform was a dark navy winter issue. Thick coat, insulated pants, black gloves, boots with deep tread. Snow clung to him anyway, as if the weather believed everyone should match the landscape. The radio on his shoulder crackled with static, the kind of hiss that made him think of snakes hiding in the tall grass. If grass still existed under all this white. Daniel's patrol this evening was supposed to be simple. Check the access road, make sure the thin ice signs were still standing, confirm the old dock hadn't splintered loose. Simple in North Ridge meant nothing screamed. That was when the call came, if it could be called that. It wasn't a clean dispatch tone, no calm voice listing coordinates. It was a half-panicked transmission that punched through the static like a fist through paper. North Ridge PD, anyone?" The speaker's voice belonged to Hank Lasker, a local fisherman who looked like he'd been carved out of pine bark and stubbornness. Hank was in his late 60s, white, short, and wiry, with a bristly gray beard and a knit cap that always sat crooked as if it too had given up on straight lines. He was known around town for two things: catching trout when nobody else could, and complaining about everything with a theatrical flair that somehow made people fond of him. Daniel had once watched Hank scold a vending machine as if it were a disobedient child, but on the radio now, Hank's humor was gone. There's something out on the ice near the East Bend. I thought it was a board, driftwood, but it moved, like something breathing." Daniel stopped walking. His breath turned into a pale cloud and vanished. "Hank," he said, voice even. "Where are you?" "By the old boathouse road. I'm not going out there. I'm not that stupid." Hank's words came fast, then slower, like his fear had tripped over itself. "It's not a deer. Too small. It's tied to something, Dan. I swear it's tied." The word tied landed in Daniel's chest with the weight of a stone. In winter, the lake took people by accident. One wrong step, one bad idea, a crack that sounded like thunder too late. But tied meant intention, tied meant hands, tied meant a story with a villain who wore gloves. "I'm on my way," Daniel said. He clicked his mic off, and for a second the silence felt like the world holding its breath. Then he turned and moved, not running. Running on ice made heroes out of fools, but fast, controlled the way a man moves when he knows something is slipping away minute by minute. When Daniel reached the East Bend, the wind struck him hard, sharp as a reprimand. The shoreline here curved inward, sheltered by tall pines, and the ice looked deceptively calm, a pale sheet dusted with snow. The old dock jutted out like a broken finger. Hank stood near the edge, stamping his boots and clutching a thermos, as if caffeine could ward off tragedy. Up close, Hank's face was weathered and red from cold, his eyes watery with the kind of alarm that people tried to joke away but couldn't. "There," Hank said, pointing with a trembling finger. "Out there." Daniel lifted his binoculars. At first he saw only the empty whiteness, the shallow swell of snow over ice, the faint lines where cracks had healed and cracked again like scars reopening. Then a gust rolled across the lake, thinning the powder for a heartbeat. Something dark showed through. A shape laid on top of a pale board near a jagged seam of ice. Daniel's stomach tightened. "Stay back," he told Hank. His voice was calm, but it had edges now. "It's alive?" Hank whispered. "I don't know yet," Daniel said. But he did. In the binoculars, the small shape shifted, a faint twitch, the tiniest surrender to the wind. Daniel stepped closer to the shoreline. The object was a weathered plank, maybe part of an old canoe or a broken dock piece. And on it lay a puppy, so small the world seemed too large to be allowed to hurt it. A German shepherd puppy, around 4 months old, black and tan coat flattened and crusted with ice crystals. Ears not fully upright yet, one flopped slightly as if even cartilage had grown tired. The puppy's ribs were visible beneath wet fur. It was frighteningly thin, the kind of thin that made Daniel's jaw clench because it didn't happen overnight. A rope course, pale, frayed, was wrapped around the puppy's torso, cutting under the chest and across the belly, tied tight to the board with knots that looked practiced. The puppy's paws were tucked close, pads likely raw from cold. Its eyes, half-lidded, had the glassy shine of exhaustion. It lifted its head a fraction, then let it fall, as if the effort cost too much. Daniel lowered the binoculars. The air tasted metallic. In his mind, winter wasn't just weather anymore. It was an ancient judge, watching to see who would fail. "Dispatch," he said into his radio, switching to the emergency channel. "Unit Crow at Silverpine Lake, East Bend. I have—" He paused, because saying it out loud made it real. "A dog. A puppy. Tied to a board on the ice. It's alive but hypothermic. Requesting immediate backup, rescue rope, and EMS standby. And notify animal control and the shelter director." A beat of static. Then the dispatcher's voice, steady and professional, came through. "Copy, Unit Crow. Confirm. Live animal on ice. Restrained. Back up en route. ETA 4 minutes. Advise, do not step onto unstable ice. Daniel almost laughed, one sharp, humorless sound that would have startled him if it came from someone else. The advice was correct and also useless, the way advice often was when a life was slipping out of reach. He looked at the ice. The seam near the board was ugly, a line where the lake had opened and closed again, leaving weakness like a poorly healed bone. Daniel knew the rules. He also knew the rules didn't hold a shivering puppy. He opened the trunk of his patrol SUV and pulled out what he could: a throwbag rope, an emergency blanket, a small ice awl set, and a flat rescue sled board used for winter water incidents. Not perfect, but better than courage alone. Hank hovered behind him, shaking. "You're gonna go out there," Hank said. It wasn't a question. "I'm gonna bring him back," Daniel replied. He glanced over his shoulder, and for a moment his expression softened. "Hank, I need you to do something useful." Hank straightened automatically, grateful to be given a job. "Yeah, anything. Keep talking to dispatch if I stop responding, and if I fall through, you do not—" Daniel held Hank's eyes. "You do not come after me. You stay on shore and throw the rope if I need it. You hear me?" Hank's mouth tightened, and his eyes shone with fear and reluctant respect. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I hear you." Daniel fastened the rope around his waist and anchored the other end around a sturdy pine, looping it twice. He tested it with a hard pull. The rope held. He laid the rescue sled board down and eased onto it, spreading his weight like a man trying not to offend a sleeping dragon. The ice groaned in reply, a low sound that made Hank swear under his breath. Daniel pushed forward inch by inch on the board, using his hands and knees. Snow stung his cheeks. His gloves scraped ice. The wind slapped his coat like an angry flag. Somewhere deep under the surface, the lake shifted, a slow, ominous roll. Daniel kept his movements measured, his mind narrowed to 3 things: weight distribution, rope tension, and the puppy's shallow rise and fall. As he drew closer, he could see more detail. The rope fibers stiffened with frost, the puppy's whiskers rimed with ice, a faint tremble running through its body. The puppy's eyes tracked Daniel's approach, unfocused but aware. It made a sound, barely a whimper, more like breath catching on grief. "Hey," Daniel murmured. His voice came out softer than he meant, the way voices did when they met something helpless. "Hey, little man, don't you dare leave yet." The puppy's nose twitched. It tried to lift its head again. It couldn't hold it. Daniel reached the board. His fingers found the knot, hard as stone with frozen water. The knot was a deliberate thing, tied by someone patient and cruel. Daniel's anger flared hot enough to feel absurd in the cold. He pulled his pocket knife, blade shining briefly like a sliver of moon. He worked carefully, sawing through rope without nicking the puppy's skin. The rope gave way with a snap. The puppy sagged, suddenly free, and Daniel slid his arms under the small body. The puppy weighed almost nothing, just bone and stubbornness wrapped in wet fur. Daniel drew it against his chest, shielding it from the wind. The puppy's heartbeat was fast and weak, like a bird trapped in a storm. Hank's voice shouted from shore, blurred by wind. "You got him?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the puppy's face, at the way its eyes tried to focus, at the way it didn't fight, didn't snap, didn't whine, only endured. The snow kept falling, indifferent and endless, like an ancient god who had seen this story too many times. Daniel pressed the puppy gently against his coat, and the puppy's nose nudged his glove in a faint, searching motion. It wasn't gratitude yet. It was survival. It was a question shaped like breath. Daniel swallowed the hard knot in his throat. "Yeah," he said into the radio, voice rougher now. "I have him. Returning to shore. Animal is alive. Repeat, alive." He began to move back, inch by inch, dragging the rescue board, keeping the puppy wrapped in the emergency blanket. The ice creaked again, as if disappointed. And as Northridge's winter watched, silent and severe, one small life left the lake's frozen altar and came home in the arms of a man who had once believed he was too late for miracles. The emergency clinic in Northridge was an old brick building that smelled of antiseptic, damp wool, and coffee brewed too strong for the hour. Snow clung to the windows like curious ghosts. The town's street lamps cast long amber fingers across the parking lot, and when Officer Daniel Crow carried the puppy through the doors, the light behind him made the falling snow look like the world itself was quietly breaking into prayer. Inside, Dr. Evelyn Moore took over without ceremony. She was 50, white, slender, hair pinned in a practical bun streaked with silver, her movements economical and calm, the kind of calm forged by decades of watching life hang from thin threads. She had once been married to a man who loved the sea more than people, and when he drowned off the Oregon coast years ago, Evelyn stopped believing in coincidence. Since then, she treated every patient as if some unseen ledger were being kept. "Table 2, she said, already sliding on gloves. "Nurse, warming blankets. Slow forth, no shock heating." Two techs appeared. Maya, early 30s, Latina, small and fast with anxious eyes, and Jonah, 25, tall and broad, a former college lineman who spoke to animals in whispers as if afraid of breaking them. Daniel hovered uselessly at the edge of the room, boots dripping meltwater onto the tile. The puppy lay motionless on the stainless table, ribs showing beneath the soaked black and tan fur, ears half-folded like wilted flags. The rope burn around its belly was raw and swollen. The sight of it struck Daniel harder than the cold ever could. "How bad?" Daniel asked. Evelyn's gaze never left the puppy. "Hypothermia, severe dehydration, possible frost injury to the pads, and," she gestured at the rope mark, "deliberate restraint. Whoever did this wanted him not to come back." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. "Can you save him?" Evelyn finally looked up at him. Her eyes were gray and steady, the color of rivers in winter. "I can try," she said. "But he's been fighting longer than he should have had to." They worked in silence. Warmth came in layers. Fluids dripped like measured hope. The puppy's chest rose shallowly, then slightly stronger. A tremor ran through his legs as if winter itself were being argued with inside his bones. Daniel stood there, still clutching the severed rope in one hand, as though he might strangle the ghost of whoever tied it. He did not know why he kept it. Evidence, maybe, or a promise. Evelyn finished and peeled off her gloves. "We'll keep him overnight. At least a week of monitoring. He's not out of danger." Daniel nodded. "What about the rope?" Evelyn's mouth hardened. "Animal cruelty. File the report." Daniel already had. The puppy opened one eye then, just a slit. It found Daniel's face. And Daniel, who had once failed a family in the snow, felt something inside him shift like a glacier cracking. He whispered, "Hey, little guy." The puppy made no sound, just breathed. They put him in an incubated recovery crate by the far wall, wrapped in a silver thermal blanket that made him look like a fallen star. Daniel stayed long after his shift officially ended, sitting on a plastic chair, elbows on his knees, staring through the glass. Evelyn returned with a clipboard. "We need a name for the file." Daniel did not think. "Atlas." Evelyn paused. "Why Atlas?" Daniel watched the puppy's chest rise. "Because he's carrying more than he should have to." Evelyn wrote it down. Something in her expression softened. Outside, the snow thickened. Day 1. Atlas did not eat. He did not whine. He existed. Daniel came after his shift, after changing out of uniform. He spoke quietly, telling Atlas about the town, about the bakery that burned cinnamon too often, about the old man who fed pigeons behind the post office, about the sheriff who still believed coffee should hurt. Atlas listened with one half-open eye. Day 2. Atlas swallowed water. His breathing steadied. Daniel brought a blanket from his own bed and draped it across the crate. Day 3. Atlas lifted his head for the first time. It cost him everything. Daniel smiled then, a small, cracked thing that surprised him. That night, Atlas dreamed. His legs began to move, slow and panicked, as if the lake had climbed inside him. His chest heaved. A sound leaked from his throat, too small to be a cry, too broken to be a whimper. Daniel stood up instantly. "Hey, hey, buddy!" Atlas's eyes flew open. Terror flooded them. He snapped blindly at the air, teeth clicking once against Daniel's glove. Daniel did not pull away. "I'm here," Daniel said. "You're safe." Atlas froze. His body trembled. Then his nose touched Daniel's hand, just once, as if testing whether the world still existed. Day 4. Atlas licked food from a spoon. Daniel laughed. The sound startled them both. Day 5. Atlas tried to sit, failed, tried again. Daniel whispered, "That's it." Atlas collapsed. Daniel did not cheer. He just stayed. On the 6th night, a state officer arrived to document the injuries. He was a young man named Trevor Collins, pale, red-haired, stiff in his new jacket, clearly uncomfortable around both animals and grief. He photographed the rope marks, the pads of Atlas's feet, the knots of the severed rope. "Someone tied him well," Trevor said quietly. "Not a kid." Daniel nodded. "They wanted him gone." Trevor's mouth twisted. "We'll find them." Daniel hoped so. Day 7. Atlas stood. Not well, not long, but he stood. Daniel exhaled a breath he had been holding for a week. Evelyn said, "We'll transfer him to Northridge Shelter tomorrow. He needs quiet recovery and legal holding." Daniel's chest tightened. "Can I be there?" Evelyn studied him. She had seen men like Daniel before, men who believed if they just stayed long enough, nothing bad would happen again. "We'll allow supervised visits," she said. The shelter was warm and smelled of hay, pine cleaner, and dog food. Linda Parker, the director, a woman in her late 50s with soft eyes and iron posture, signed Atlas in under legal hold 30 days. Linda had lost her husband to cancer and had never forgiven the universe for thinking that was acceptable. Since then, she had built the shelter into a sanctuary that ran on stubborn love. Atlas's kennel sat near the back, quiet, away from barking. That first night, Atlas did not sleep. He paced weakly. His paws tapped the floor. His breath shook. Daniel pulled up a chair beside the kennel. "Hey," he said, "I'm not leaving." Atlas stared at him, then lay down. One paw slid forward until it touched the metal bars. Daniel placed 2 fingers against it. Outside, winter pressed its face against the glass. Week 2. Atlas walked 3 steps. Daniel counted them like holy numbers. Week 3. Atlas ate a full bowl. Daniel almost cried into his coffee. Week 4. Atlas followed Daniel down the hall, shaky but determined. One evening, snow came down in thick, quiet sheets. The shelter lights dimmed for closing. Daniel remained, sitting beside Atlas's kennel. Atlas slept at last, breathing deep, paws twitching faintly as if the lake were losing its grip on him. Daniel rested his forehead against the cool metal bars and whispered, "You made it." And somewhere beyond the walls, the winter that had tried to claim a life was forced, just for a moment, to let go. Winter in North Ridge did not loosen its grip just because Atlas had survived the clinic. Snow kept falling as if the sky had been given an order and refused to revise it. The wind prowled the streets after dark, nosing into door frames and rattling window panes, the way old grief sometimes returned when people were certain they had already paid its price. Inside North Ridge Shelter, the lights were kept low after evening rounds, the air warm and hushed, thick with the smells of pine cleaner, hay, and the many quiet lives learning how to trust again. Atlas's kennel sat along the back corridor, where the sound of barking faded into a distant, broken echo. The little German shepherd, 4 months old now, by best estimate, still too thin, still unsteady, but no longer hovering at the edge of the world, lay curled on a wool blanket. His black and tan coat was beginning to fluff where the silver thermal foil had once pressed it flat. One ear had found the courage to stand. The other still leaned sideways as if undecided about the future. Officer Daniel Crow arrived after every shift. He was still wearing the scar over his eyebrow and the weight of every winter before this one. He would remove his coat, hang it on the hook outside the kennel row, then sit on the floor beside Atlas, legs folded, the way men do when they intend to stay. The other volunteers had learned not to disturb the ritual. Linda Parker, the shelter director, 58, broad-shouldered, warm-voiced, and carrying the steady authority of someone who had buried a husband and raised a shelter from grief, would nod at Daniel when he arrived and leave him to it. The nights were the worst. Atlas did not sleep easily. His body still remembered cold water, remembered the ache of the rope, remembered the strange floating weightlessness of abandonment. When he drifted off, it was not rest, but another kind of work. It began the 3rd night after his arrival. Daniel was telling him about a raccoon that had broken into the bakery dumpster last summer and learned how to open soda cans. "Smartest thief in town," Daniel said, trying to make the story sound heroic instead of sad when Atlas's breathing changed. It hitched. His legs twitched. Then they began to move, slow at first, then faster, as if he were running across something slick and shifting. Atlas let out a thin, broken sound. Daniel froze. The shelter was nearly empty now. Only the soft hum of the heater and the faint creak of the old building spoke. Atlas's paws scraped the kennel floor. His chest heaved. His mouth opened, silent, like a swimmer who had lost the surface. Daniel reached through the bars and touched Atlas's shoulder. "Hey, you're here. You're not there anymore." Atlas jerked awake. His eyes were wide, black pools of fear. His teeth snapped once at the air. Then his nose touched Daniel's fingers, just once, as if confirming the world was still solid. Daniel stayed like that for nearly an hour until Atlas's breathing evened out and the small body curled again into the blanket. Daniel leaned his head back against the kennel wall and closed his eyes. Outside, the wind kept walking its circles. By the end of the first week, the dreams came almost every night. Atlas would drift off, then his legs would paddle, slow and desperate, like he was still trying to reach something that did not exist anymore. Sometimes his mouth trembled, sometimes a faint yelp slipped free. Not a bark, not a cry, just a note of panic that rose from deep inside where language never lived. Daniel began staying later. He brought a thermos of coffee. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his back against the wall, the cold seeping into his bones as if winter were jealous of the space Atlas occupied in his chest. Once, near midnight, Maya, one of the shelter techs, small, dark-haired, quick, and usually full of nervous jokes, stopped in the hallway and watched them. "You know he's not technically yours," she said softly. Daniel didn't look away from Atlas. "I know," Maya nodded. "Just saying, some people disappear when it gets hard." Daniel's mouth twitched. "I'm not some people." She smiled sadly and went back to her rounds. During the days, Atlas learned small things: how to drink without coughing, how to balance for a full minute, how to follow Daniel 3 shaky steps down the hall before collapsing into a satisfied heap of dog. Each victory was celebrated quietly. No cheers, no clapping, just Daniel's low voice. "That's it. That's good." But the nights belonged to memory. One stormy evening near the end of the second week, the shelter lost power for nearly an hour. The backup lights glowed faint red. The wind outside howled like an animal searching for something it had misplaced. Atlas panicked. His whole body trembled. His breath came in fast, shallow bursts. He pressed his head against the kennel bars as if trying to push his way through them. Daniel unlocked the kennel door without thinking. Atlas climbed straight into his lap, all bones and fur and fear, his small heart racing like it had somewhere else to be. Daniel sat on the cold floor, back against the wall, arms wrapped around the trembling puppy while the storm raged outside. "I've got you," he whispered. "I'm not leaving." Atlas's breathing slowly slowed, his head tucked beneath Daniel's chin. The world shrank to 2 living creatures and the promise between them. When the power returned, Daniel didn't move. The state officer returned on the 14th day to update the case file. No owner had come forward, no witnesses yet. The rope matched supplies from a local marina. Someone in North Ridge knew something. No one was talking. Atlas didn't care about investigations. He cared about Daniel. By the 3rd week, Atlas could stand without falling. He could walk the length of the shelter hallway. His coat thickened. The raw cracks in his paws healed. But the dreams still came. Sometimes Daniel wondered if they would ever leave. Then came the morning Atlas wagged his tail for the first time. It was barely noticeable, just the slightest movement when Daniel knelt and scratched the soft spot behind Atlas's ear. But Daniel saw it. His chest tightened in a way that felt dangerously close to hope. On the 21st night, Atlas slept deeply for the first time without thrashing. Daniel sat beside the kennel until past midnight anyway, listening to the slow rhythm of Atlas's breath, to the storm easing outside, to the quiet building that had become a small universe of second chances. Linda Parker came by and crouched beside him. "You could go home," she said. "He'll be fine." Daniel looked at Atlas. "I know," he said, "but I won't be." Linda smiled with the tired kindness of someone who recognized her own past in other people's eyes. "He's teaching you something too, isn't he?" Daniel nodded. Outside, winter pressed against the windows, annoyed that its claim was weakening. Inside, Atlas slept, and for the first time since the lake had tried to keep him, the night let him go. By the fourth week, winter had taught Northridge a new language. The snow no longer fell like grief. It fell like routine. People shoveled their porches with the quiet determination of those who understood that survival was rarely dramatic, it was a schedule. At Northridge Shelter, the heaters hummed. The coffee pot was always empty too soon, and hope moved at the pace of small feet, learning how to trust the floor beneath them. Atlas, the German shepherd puppy, had grown into his name slowly. He was still thin, still fragile around the edges, but there was more substance now where there had once been only will. His coat had deepened into a rich black along his back and a warm brown along his legs and chest. The rawness on his paws had faded into pale scars. His eyes, once cloudy with exhaustion, were clear, dark, and watching. And he was watching Officer Daniel Crow. Daniel arrived every evening after shift, his boots tracked with snow, his shoulders carrying the same winter he had been carrying for years. He no longer asked permission to sit beside Atlas's kennel. Linda Parker, the shelter director, simply nodded at him from her desk, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back and a voice shaped by both command and compassion. Linda had buried a husband, rebuilt a life, and learned that love was not something you waited for, it was something you practiced. Atlas had started following Daniel down the hallway now. 3 weeks ago, standing had been a miracle. 2 weeks ago, walking was an argument. Now, walking had become a statement. He did not walk far, and he wobbled like a sailor on his first day at sea, but he went where Daniel went, nose low, ears alert, every step as deliberate as a vow. The shelter staff noticed. Maya, the quick-footed tech with restless eyes, whispered one night, "He only does that with you." Daniel shrugged, but something in his chest warmed anyway. Still, there was the law. Atlas was under a 30-day legal hold evidence in an investigation, not a pet. Daniel knew it. Linda knew it. Atlas knew nothing of paperwork, only that Daniel's shadow meant safety. On the 24th day, Daniel arrived to find Atlas standing at the kennel door waiting. His tail moved, small, hopeful, careful. Daniel knelt. "You getting impatient?" he asked. Atlas blinked at him, the kind of blink that felt like an answer. Winter chose that night to remind everyone that healing was not the same as forgetting. A storm rolled down from the mountains after sunset, thick, heavy, and loud. Snow struck the roof like handfuls of gravel. The wind forced its way through every crack it could find, a thief testing locks. Inside the shelter, the lights dimmed as the generator kicked on. The building sighed. Atlas stiffened. Daniel saw it instantly. The way Atlas's body went rigid, the way his ears flattened, the way his breathing jumped from calm to quick, shallow bursts. The memory of cold water, of rope, of drifting helplessness rose in him like a tide that had learned new tricks. Atlas began to pace, then to shake. Daniel opened the kennel. Atlas did not hesitate. He climbed into Daniel's lap, pressed his head beneath Daniel's chin, and held on. Daniel stayed on the floor for nearly 2 hours, one arm around the puppy, the other braced against the wall. He spoke in low, steady tones nonsense about his first car, about the ridiculous pie contest at the county fair, about a radio station that only played sad country songs after midnight. Atlas listened. The shaking faded. When the storm finally eased, Atlas was asleep in Daniel's arms. Some things you did not argue with. By the 27th day, Atlas could trot just a little. He had gained weight. His paws no longer winced when he stepped on the cold floor. And the nightmares, while not gone, came less often, less violently. But the lake still owned a piece of him. Daniel decided to test something. On a clear morning, he clipped a leash onto Atlas's collar and led him outside the shelter. The world was white and brilliant, the sky pale blue, the kind of cold that made every sound sharp. Atlas hesitated at the door. Snow had not been kind to him. Daniel waited. Atlas took one step, then another. They walked slowly along the sidewalk, the leash loose, the town quiet. They did not go near Silver Pine Lake. Not yet. This was about teaching Atlas that the world existed beyond memory. A child on a sled laughed in the distance. Atlas's ears twitched. Daniel smiled. On the 30th day, Linda called Daniel into her office. The legal hold was over. No owner had come forward. The investigation remained open, but Atlas was now free. Daniel's throat tightened. What happens now? Linda met his eyes. What do you want to happen? Daniel thought of the nights on the shelter floor, of the way Atlas followed him, of the promise he had made in a voice too low for the world to hear. I'd like to foster him, Daniel said. Linda's mouth curved. I was hoping you'd say that. They completed the paperwork together. Daniel's hand shook when he signed his name. Atlas waited outside the office door, sitting perfectly still as if he understood the gravity of the moment. When Daniel stepped out, leash in hand, Atlas's tail moved, slow, steady, certain. You ready to go home? Daniel asked. Atlas stood, and for the first time since the lake, he walked without looking back. Daniel's apartment above the hardware store was small. One bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a window that rattled in heavy wind. Daniel moved the coffee table aside, laid down blankets, set out food and water. Atlas sniffed every corner, then returned to Daniel's side. That night, when the lights went out, Atlas panicked. Not loudly, just a small, heartbreaking sound that rose from deep inside his chest. Daniel switched the lamp back on and sat on the floor beside him. Atlas pressed into Daniel's leg and did not move, so Daniel slept on the floor. Outside, winter kept falling. Inside, something permanent had begun. Winter loosened its grip on North Ridge slowly, like an old king reluctant to surrender the throne. Snow still rimmed the rooftops and shaded the streets, but the air had softened. The sun climbed higher. The wind, though cold, no longer carried the same promise of punishment. 3 weeks had passed since Atlas moved into Officer Daniel Crow's apartment. The German Shepherd puppy was no longer the trembling, half-frozen shape pulled from the ice. He had gained weight. His coat shone where once it had clung in dull strands. The scars on his paws had faded to pale lines. And most importantly, his eyes now held something they had never carried before: expectation. Every morning, Daniel rose before dawn. Atlas followed him to the kitchen, nails tapping on the worn floorboards, tail moving with cautious hope. Daniel poured coffee. Atlas waited for breakfast. Their small routines formed a quiet covenant neither of them had ever signed, but both of them obeyed. The nightmares still came, but less often. Some nights Atlas would jolt awake, breath ragged, legs paddling the air as if the lake had crept into the room again. Daniel would sit on the floor, press Atlas's head against his chest, whisper the same promise over and over. "You're safe now. I've got you." And Atlas would believe him, a little more each time. On that afternoon, the sky was pale blue, the kind that makes winter look almost harmless. Daniel clipped a leash onto Atlas's collar and guided him out of the apartment. The town was quiet. No sirens, no shouting, just the scrape of boots on ice-softened pavement and the distant clatter of wind chimes from Mrs. Holloway's porch. They walked toward the old footpath that wound along the edge of Silverpine Lake. Daniel's chest tightened as they neared it. He hadn't brought Atlas here yet. He had avoided the place the way people avoid old photographs that hurt too much to throw away. But Atlas needed to face it, and Daniel knew it. The lake lay before them, still half frozen, the surface broken by long, dark seams. Snowbanks lined the shore. Sunlight shimmered across the ice, harmless and beautiful, pretending nothing terrible had ever happened there. Atlas stopped. His body went rigid. His ears flattened, his tail slipped low. The leash trembled as his breath grew shallow. Daniel crouched beside him. "You don't have to go any farther," he said quietly. Atlas didn't look at Daniel. He stared at the lake. The wind brushed the ice, and the sound carried, the same whisper it had made that day, a memory wrapped in weather. Atlas took one step forward, then another. His paws pressed into the snow. He paused, chest heaving, then moved again. He didn't run. He didn't retreat. He simply walked, slow, shaking, determined. Daniel followed, not pulling, not leading. They stopped several yards from the edge of the ice. Atlas sat. Daniel sat beside him. They stayed like that for a long time, the sun sliding west, the wind carrying the scent of water and pine. Atlas's breathing slowly calmed, his ears lifted, his tail gave a single careful wag. Daniel felt something in his chest loosen. "Good boy," he whispered. Atlas leaned his shoulder against Daniel's leg. They turned back together. They were halfway down the trail when it happened. A shout, high-pitched, terrified. Daniel spun. Down the slope, near the old wooden steps, a boy, no more than 7, had slipped on the icy planks. He was sliding, scrambling, arms flailing, feet skidding toward the jagged edge of broken ice where the lake met the shore. Time collapsed. Daniel broke into a run. So did Atlas. No command, no hesitation. The leash fell from Daniel's hand as Atlas surged forward, paws pounding the snow, body low, focused, faster than Daniel had ever seen him move. The boy cried out, losing his footing, momentum carrying him straight toward the dark crack in the ice. Atlas reached him first. He threw his body across the boy's path, chest slamming into the child's knees, knocking him sideways into the snow. The impact sent both of them rolling. Atlas scrambled up instantly, planting himself between the boy and the edge, legs braced, body rigid. A living barrier. The boy sobbed, clinging to Atlas's neck. Daniel arrived seconds later, breath tearing from his lungs. He dropped to his knees, scooped the boy into his arms, pulled him away from the ice. The boy was scraped, shaken, terrified, but alive. Atlas stood where he had planted himself, chest rising and falling, snow clinging to his fur, eyes fixed on the lake as if daring it to try again. Daniel's hands shook as he set the boy on solid ground. A man came running from the trail above. The boy's father, face pale, eyes wild. He grabbed his son, holding him so tightly it looked painful. "Thank you," he kept saying. "Oh, God, thank you." Daniel nodded, but his eyes were on Atlas. Atlas turned, walked to Daniel, and pressed his head against Daniel's chest. Daniel knelt and wrapped both arms around him. For a moment, the world went very quiet. The father cleared his throat. "Your dog, he saved him." Daniel swallowed. "He saved himself first." They walked home slowly after that. Atlas didn't look back at the lake. That night, Atlas slept without dreaming. Daniel lay on the couch, one hand resting on Atlas's back, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, marveling at how close the world had come to taking him again, and how fiercely Atlas had refused. Winter had tried to reclaim what it had lost. Atlas had said no. Spring did not arrive in Northridge all at once. It came the way healing always does, quietly, unevenly, and without asking permission. Snow still clung to the north-facing roofs, and the mountains wore their white crowns with stubborn pride. But down in the streets, puddles formed and birds returned to the telephone wires, like notes being written back into the world. 3 weeks had passed since the day Atlas stopped a boy from sliding into the broken ice. That moment changed everything. Not loudly, not with sirens or headlines, but in the way that the town began to look at the dog walking beside Officer Daniel Crow, and in the way Daniel himself walked a little straighter, as if some invisible burden had finally shifted. Atlas was stronger now. His ribs no longer showed. His coat gleamed deep black and warm brown under the sun. His stride had smoothed from wobble into confidence. His tail no longer asked questions when it moved. It made statements. And yet the nights still whispered. Sometimes Atlas's legs twitched in sleep, faint echoes of water and cold and helplessness. But when Daniel leaned over the side of the bed and murmured, "You're here, buddy," the twitching stopped. Atlas would sigh, heavy and full, the way creatures do when they finally believe they are staying. The shelter called one afternoon. Linda Parker stood in Daniel's doorway, her silver hair pinned back, hands clasped. "You know the paperwork's ready," she said. Daniel did. He had been carrying the decision in his chest for weeks now, the way you carry a secret ring in your pocket before you ask someone to stay forever. They went to the shelter together. Atlas walked through the front doors like he had always belonged there and was simply returning to collect something he had left behind. Linda slid the folder across the desk. Daniel signed. His hand didn't shake this time. Atlas sat at his feet, tail sweeping the floor. Outside, the wind softened. Chuck. The ceremony was nothing official. No banners, no speeches, just the small group of officers from the North Ridge Station, a few shelter volunteers, and one German Shepherd puppy who did not understand paperwork but understood everything else. Captain Roy Whitaker, a tall man with a permanent squint from years of mountain sun, knelt and clipped a bright orange vest over Atlas's shoulders. The patch read, "Honorary K9, Trainee." "It's not a badge yet," Roy said gruffly, "but it's a promise." Atlas stood still as the vest settled against his chest. He lifted his head and looked straight at Daniel. Daniel crouched in front of him. "You did it," he whispered. Atlas licked his cheek once. The wind carried laughter across the parking lot. That summer, Atlas began coming to the station. Not to work, not yet, but to learn. He followed Daniel through the halls, sniffed radios and boots, watched the officers train. The men joked that he took notes better than the rookies. Atlas learned hand signals. He learned to stay calm when sirens wailed. He learned to sit beside Daniel's desk while reports were written late into the night. Most of all, he learned that the world could be loud without being dangerous. Then, in late August, the scream came. It cut across the beach like a blade. Daniel was off duty, walking the shoreline with Atlas. the orange vest bright against the sand. A boy, about 7, was struggling in the surf. The tide had shifted faster than expected. The water was pulling him sideways. Daniel ran. Atlas ran faster. The boy went under. Daniel's heart dropped into his throat. And then Atlas was already in the water, powerful strokes slicing through the waves, moving not with fear but with purpose. He reached the boy, caught the sleeve of his jacket gently between his teeth, braced his body between the child and the current, and held. Daniel reached them seconds later. They pulled the boy to shore together. The boy's mother collapsed into the sand, sobbing, clutching her son. People gathered. Phones appeared. Someone whispered, "That's the dog." Atlas stood there, dripping, chest heaving, eyes locked on Daniel. Daniel knelt and pressed his forehead to Atlas's. "You came back to the water," he whispered. Atlas's tail wagged once. The photo went everywhere. Atlas, soaked and shining in the sun, vest clinging to his chest, standing at the edge of the surf while the rescued boy's hand rested on his shoulder. The headline read, "From Abandoned to Hero." Daniel didn't care about the attention. He cared that the nightmares faded. He cared that Atlas slept through the night. He cared that the lake no longer owned a piece of him. That fall, the patch changed. The new vest read, "Rescue K9. Atlas stood taller when it was fastened." Or maybe that was just Daniel's imagination. Either way, the winter that once tried to claim a life no longer had the final word. Somewhere in the mountains, snow was already forming again. But this time, Atlas was ready. Sometimes God sends miracles in the smallest forms: a wounded puppy, a frozen night, a tired heart that refuses to give up. And through them, he reminds us that no life is ever forgotten and no pain is ever wasted. In our daily lives, we may feel broken, abandoned, or unseen, but just like Atlas, we are never truly alone. God places people in our path at the exact moment we need them most, and when we choose kindness, when we choose courage, when we choose love, we become part of that miracle too. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Today, leave a comment and tell us what this message means to you. And remember to subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you stories that lift your spirit. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home and guide your steps. And if you believe in His miracles, please type Amen in the comments so we can pray together as one community.